All right, so today we are going to talk about web components. This is me. I'm Nolan Erck. I run SAC Interactive, this monthly meetup, and coincidentally, I am also the speaker this month. That's not usually the case, but that's how scheduling worked out this time. Here's the obligatory ego slide. Please mute your microphones if you could, folks. We have a lot of background noise that just came in. I run a consulting business called South of Shasta. I'm also VP of engineering for a tech startup in downtown SAC called Emission Control. Emission Control is building a SaaS platform to help basically make the world a cleaner place by reducing the carbon footprint of different businesses on the West Coast. And South of Shasta is my consulting business. We build web and mobile apps for whoever needs something, and also provide training and teach classes on a variety of web and mobile technologies. I manage this user group along with Rob and Bill, who are teaching classes tonight. Please mute your microphone, whoever's got one still going. I used to program video games, and I'm willing to bet I go to more concerts and buy more records than anyone else here at the meetup. My house looks like this. I have vinyl everywhere. I'm quite proud of my record collection. If you don't want to take notes, or if you're a slow typer or anything like that, just make a note of this slide right here. That is my GitHub account. And this is where all of the slides and all of the code demos we're going to look at today are located. So just make a snapshot of that, and then you don't have to frantically type down code samples or take screenshots of everything. You can just go to that repo later and grab whatever you want from there. Hopefully, everyone is comfortable with sort of modern JavaScript constructs. We're not going to do anything too fancy, but hopefully you should understand some basic things like object-oriented programming. You know what like inheritance is and what a constructor does, things of that nature. You should have some familiarity with basic DOM stuff when I say things like an item is registered with the DOM and that sort of thing. You should know what that means. Hang on for 1 second. I'm sorry. I've got to go through and figure out who's still not muted and fix this. We have a ton of background noise coming through. There. All right, I think that's fixed. Sorry about that. Let's go back and share this now again. And let's try that again. So hopefully you're familiar with modern JavaScript stuff, constructors and inheritance, that sort of thing. You know what it means when someone says things like you register an element with the DOM or you deregister an element with the DOM. If you happen to have used a server-side tool like ColdFusion or JSP or anything of that nature that has the construct of server-side tags, ASP.NET would work as well. Any experience with that would also be kind of helpful with this sort of thing. And you should have experience using, general APIs, what JSON and AJAX are, basic things of that nature. So we're going to look at what web components are. I'll show you some basic examples of how to use them and some different concepts that come along with building them. I'll show you how to use web components along with a server-side language. I'm going to use CFML for this example, but the things we're doing would work exactly the same way with PHP or .NET or anything else that is more of a server-side environment. And I'll show you some tips and some other goodies you can look at later on for taking web components to the next level after you get comfortable with the basics. And I'll point you towards some other resources after that as well. So what is a web component? It's a way to make your own HTML tags. They're based on JavaScript. So you write a chunk of JavaScript, and that lets you write your own tags like p or div or table. They're processed in the web browser. They are not processed server-side. So if you're familiar with web controls from like ASP.NET or CFML or things like that, same kind of construct where you build like a component-y thing that you invoke by using a tag-style syntax. The difference, though, is these all happen in your browser at the JavaScript side. They don't happen in the cloud or on the server at all. And to do basic vanilla web components, you do not need to use any third-party libraries of any sort. That's plain vanilla JavaScript, and they work really, really fast. They're not framework specific. All of the web components we build will be done with vanilla JavaScript. However, you can use them with all of the JavaScript frameworks out there. So web components work with Vue, Angular, React, Svelte. Whatever JavaScript framework comes out a month from now or a year from now, they'll all work exactly the same way in every framework that comes out. They also work with none of the frameworks. If you wanted to build an app using nothing but vanilla JavaScript and web components, you can do that. And they also can be integrated with any server-side tool you have, PHP, ASP.NET, anything of that nature. They do require knowing a little bit of OOP, like I mentioned before. You should be familiar with what inheritance does and what a constructor does, have a basic understanding of like class level variables that live inside a class and what the scope is of those variables. Basic knowledge of how the DOM works, like I mentioned before. You do not need to use Node or TypeScript or any third-party libraries like React or jQuery or anything of the sort. It's all plain JS. And they can, of course, connect to any backend server you have. So if you're on .NET, PHP, Ruby, Go, COBOL, whatever you got, as long as it can kick JSON back to the web browser, you can connect your web component with them. Browser support is pretty good. Most everything supports it except IE11. If you are still supporting IE11, even Microsoft has said do not support IE11 anymore, so you can ignore that, hopefully. There's a tiny different shade of green for Safari and Safari iOS. That's basically because there's one or two little, what they're calling bugs in the rendering engine for that browser. And the folks in charge of the rendering engine have said, yeah, we're not going to fix that because there's a decent workaround for that bug. We're just going to go with the workaround instead. I personally have never run into an issue where that slight difference in compatibility is actually a concern. So as far as I'm concerned, web components work everywhere in all modern web browsers. And with that, let's take a look at our first demo. Hello World demo. This will be nothing terribly fancy. You can see I have a simple HTML file. I'm including hello world.js, and I have a tag in here that says hello-world. That's obviously not a real tag baked into your browser like div or p. Let's see what happens though when I run that demo. Go over here, demo 1. You can see hello and welcome is what I get on the screen. Let's take a look at that code in that hello world.js file, and you can see how this worked. Not a ton going on here. I have a class called hello world that extends HTML element, and I've got a thing in there called connected callback with one line of code. This.text context equals that text that you saw on my screen a minute ago. And down below, after the end of that class, I've got this one line of code down here. So our class, we can name it whatever we want. It has to extend HTML element. That's the inheritance thing that tells the browser this class we're making is going to be a new tag in the browser somewhere. Connected callback is a method that runs when your web component is attached to the DOM, which is fancy speak for saying when line 8 runs, since that's where my tag exists in the file, that's when that connected callback method is going to fire. And if I had this tag on lines 8, 12, and 14, then connected callback would run when it hits lines 8, 12, and 14 in my file, and it would do something in that method 3 times. And then after the class is done being defined, we have this custom elements.define method down here. And you can notice that that has the name of my class and this hello-world thing over here. This is how we tell the browser this class is going to be referenced in the HTML side with that tag name, hello-world, hello-world. There's our web component. And that's how we got this fancy green text to appear on the screen. Notice that we had hello-world in our naming convention for the tag over here on line 8. The dash is required. Anytime you make a web component, you have to have a hyphen somewhere in the name of that component. The reason for that is this avoids naming collisions with future versions of HTML. So let's say in HTML version 20, if they come out with a tag called treehouse, one word, and I write a web component called treehouse, one word, when somebody goes to my website and their browser hits the code, their browser is not going to know which treehouse tag do we process, the baked in one in HTML or the one that Nolan wrote as a web component. So to avoid any differences, all web components have to have a hyphen somewhere in the name like that. So usually what I would recommend is use the hyphen to your advantage. Come up with like a prefix for the collections of components you make. Maybe call your components all things like UI-treehouse, or if you worked at Apple, maybe Apple-treehouse or whatever. Come up with some way to use the hyphen part as a way to organize the names of your files. Just get a little bit more self-documentation out of the code that you have to write because of how web components are named. And as we mentioned before, it extends that HTML element thing. That's just how you turn the machinery on to say, I'm building a new custom tag for my website. That connected callback method is the code that runs whenever your element is added to the DOM. And a custom element dot define thing is what registers it with the custom element registry, which is the fancy way of saying this is how you name your tag something and turn it into a web component you can actually call at the HTML level. Handful of lifecycle methods inside a web component. We saw connected callback a minute ago. That's the one that draws the stuff on the screen when your web component first gets added to the DOM. You can also have a constructor. Constructors work just like any other object-oriented construct in programming, Java, C++, whatever. The constructor does the exact same thing here that it does in any of those languages. They're not technically required, but obviously good OO practices dictate that you should probably have a constructor whenever possible in your components. And then there are a handful of other lifecycle methods that are all optional depending on what kind of thing you do or don't want to do with your components. Like I mentioned, constructors. I did not have one here in my hello world sample. Notice there's no constructor here. That was just to keep the hello world sample as small as possible to fit on the screen and make it easy to show how little code you have to write to get a web component to do something. But in real world situations, I would pretty much always have a constructor in my components. Connected callback is the one that we just looked at that does something when your component is registered to the DOM. That makes your component start doing stuff in your web app. You've got a couple methods called observed attributes and attribute change callback. These sort of work in tandem with each other. You can have attributes that go into your web component, just like you can have attributes on any HTML element. Like if you have div tag, you can have like class equals something, ID equals something. Those are your attributes. You can have attributes for web components as well. You use observed attributes and attribute change callback to do two things: to tell the browser essentially, these are the attributes my web component is going to have that I actually care about. And this is what I want you to do when one of those attributes changes from one value to another. If you don't have any attributes, then you don't have to write either of those methods. You can also write a lifecycle method called disconnected callback that runs when your element is disconnected from the DOM. If you write some JavaScript somewhere that removes it from the document, you can have this one run that fires and does cleanup of some sort. Again, this is also optional. You've got adopted callback. Corbin and I get into discussions about this once in a while about how this part works. I maintain this is a weird method that I've never had an actual use for. Adopted callback is when you have two documents. If you drag your web component from one of them to the other one, and you want something to happen when it moves from one to the other one, this adopted callback method will fire and do something. I've looked around on the web a few times for real world situations of when people use this. I've yet to come up with anything. A few people have said it's kind of useful if you have iframes on a page. You've got your page divided up into 2 or 3 iframes, and you drag a web component from one spot to the other. If you are, in fact, building an app and you're using both web components and iframes to do so, please shoot me a message. I would love to know how you came about deciding on that as your design for the application. Attributes, they look just like they do in any HTML element. First name dash Nolan or equals Nolan. To get the attributes to work, you got to have a constructor that calls the super constructor. And then you have to use those lifecycle methods that I mentioned a little bit earlier, observed attributes and attribute change callback. And I'll show you what those look like right now. Attributes. So here's a new version of our hello world tag. This one just has a couple attributes being passed in, first name and last name. And here's a slightly modified version of our hello world component from before. This one I have a constructor, and it's calling the super constructor, which is the constructor in HTML element. I'm setting the first name property to a default value. Notice that I am not setting the last name to a default value. You don't have to set defaults. You can if you want to. And then I've got those two lifecycle methods I mentioned earlier. Observed attributes, literally just an array of these are the attribute names that I care about. So if somebody were using this tag and in addition to first name and last name, they had an attribute called favorite color. Since favorite color is not listed in my array of observed attributes, adding favorite color to line 8 would not actually cause any code to trigger and do anything. Whereas first name and last name are referenced here, when those values change, it would actually cause my attribute change callback method to run and do something. You'll notice that in my attribute change callback, it basically looks for if the old value is equal to the new value, then go ahead and jump out. We don't need to do anything. If we did in fact get a new value that's different from what we had before, then save the new value into this dot first name or this dot last name, whatever the attribute is that we care about. For the most part, when you start using web components, if you want to have basic, what I'll call attribute functionality, you'll take a copy of this method and paste it into your web component, and it really won't change until you do something a little more involved. You'll also take a copy of this method, paste it into your web component, and the only part of this that will change is, of course, the names of the attributes that you want your web component to deal with. And then down below that, I've got my connected callback, which is similar to what we had in the Hello World demo. This dot text content equals, and then you can see I have some text in here from a conference I spoke at a couple weeks ago. Hello, and I'm using the backtick and curly brace notation here to do this dot first name to grab whatever these properties are set to, replace them in here. Welcome to CF Summit East. And then when I load that text up, or when I load that demo up in the browser, number 2, I get hello, Nolan Erck, and welcome to CF Summit East. Yay, there's my text. So nothing terribly convoluted yet. There's our demo. Let's take a look at multiple instances of that tag being called. Close these. Go in here. This is the exact same web component that we had in the last demo. The only difference is I've now got 4 of them in here. So John, Paul, George, and Ringo. The text inside it is hello, the same placeholders essentially as before, and welcome to CF Summit East. So I should get hello, John Lennon, hello, Paul McCartney, hello, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, of course. Let's see what happens when I run that. Open this up. Number 3, multiple instances. Oh no. So what happened? Our div tags are being drawn on the screen instead of being turned into actual div tags and making everything show up on its own line as a block level element. Let's see if we can tell what happened there. You cannot actually add HTML tags into that this.text content operator that we're using here in our connected callback. That can only take plain text as the thing coming into it. Otherwise, you get this kind of business, which is not what we want. So we need better functionality for our web component than the this.text content thing will let us do. We also probably want to put our CSS inside a component so that everything is organized and safe from the outside world interfering with it via some other chunk of code. If I go back here and look at this, you can see I actually have a style sheet in here that's styling our hello world tag as courier and giving it a size and a color. But this is kind of its own little rando file off to the side. It'd be nice if we can combine everything together. If you've ever used something like Angular or React or Vue, when you have a chunk of JavaScript and a chunk of CSS that all relates together as like a component level thing, you can group them together either in the same file or in related files in a subfolder. And it'd be nice to have some sort of organization to our CSS that's affecting our component, kind of linking it somehow visually, if nothing else, to our JavaScript that's running over here. And more importantly, we need to fix this problem where when we go this.text content, we just get these div tags on the screen like that. We need to do something instead of that kind of thing. This is where Shadow DOM comes into play. So Shadow DOM solves the encapsulation problem. So we have one space where we can put our CSS and our JavaScript. It attaches a separate kind of copy of the DOM for the web component outside of the one for the rest of our HTML page being used. And you do that by writing this line of code here, this dot attach shadow. Mode is either open or closed. Open means that other chunks of JavaScript in other JS files in your app can access the element, in this case, our hello world element, and do manipulations to it if it needs to. And when it's closed, that means that the DOM can only be accessed by our element itself. So other code inside our hello world.js file can manipulate our hello world.js file stuff, but code in, cheese sandwich.js file or jQuery or Vue or whatever else you have, none of that can touch it. So it just depends on, there's no right or wrong answer. It just depends on if you want to have your component be a thing that outside code can manipulate, or if you do not want it to be manipulated. And with that, let's take a look at an updated version of our demo over here. Let's close this. And we'll take a look at Shadow DOM. So our HTML file is exactly the same as it was before. No change there. We're including a hello world.js file. It's got a couple of updates to it. Our constructor is the same. Observed attributes is the same. So is our attribute changed callback. Here's where things get a little bit more tricky. In connected callback, now we have that attached shadow method. We're setting it to closed, saving that to a variable here. And then instead of this .text content, we're now using shadow.innerHTML. And inside here, I've got these backticks. I have a style block and I have a div block. And the div block is the same as it was in the previous demo. Style block is new. We can now have our CSS here inside the JS file, as opposed to a separate external file sitting off to the side if I want to do it this way. One other change you'll see is we're in the hello world tag. Notice that my CSS is not looking for hello-world. It's using this :host thing. That is Shadow DOM CSS notation for the tag that I'm in right now, which is hello-world. So you can think of :host, same as whatever this ends up being down here. And what this helps us do, among other things, is that if I change my tag name to pizza, I don't have to go back into the CSS and also do that. I can simply leave it like so. And then no matter what I change the tag name to, the CSS will always associate to the correct thing on the page. Now with that, let's go back and take a look at our demo and run the Shadow DOM version, number 4. Yay, now we have the 4 lines rendering the way we expect them to render. One thing we haven't done yet is look at what happens under the hood with this stuff. Let's inspect the element here and check out what we get in our browser. We're actually getting hello-world tags being rendered to the screen, just like P or div tags or anything like that. So these are treated as first-class citizens, web component elements. As far as the browser is concerned, they're the same as rendering a P, an input field, a checkbox, whatever. I can expand into them and see inside it, there's a shadow root inside the HTML element. And inside shadow root, there's my style block that we wrote. And there's the div tag. So you can drill into the Shadow DOM and see the stuff inside your web component if you want to. But as far as the browser is concerned, it's rendering for hello world tags. Let's go back here. So there's our Shadow DOM. Let's take a look at slots. Slots are basically the way you add content inside your web component. So when you want to do this kind of thing, you have a tag and then you have some stuff in between the opening and closing portions of the tag. Let's take a look at that like so. I'm going to close these 1, 2. And slots look like so. Here's my content, hello world, and I've got Pete Best in the middle there. And then a hello world closing tag. Since I can't hear you speaking, I'll just tell you, Pete Best is, we had Beatles in the last example, John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Pete Best was the original drummer for the Beatles before Ringo Starr. The rumor is that Pete Best was better looking than Paul McCartney and John Lennon. So girls were hanging out with Pete Best after the shows. So they fired Pete and hired Ringo Starr instead. So the girls would start hanging out with Paul McCartney and John Lennon. You get free Beatles trivia in my presentations, no extra charge. So here's my tag, hello Pete Best. Most of this, again, is the same as before. Constructor, all the attribute stuff is the same. Connected callback, pretty close to the same. We've got the Shadow DOM stuff up here as before. And I've got this slot tag instead of the this.firstname, this.lastname stuff that we saw previously. So you can do it that way, where you pass attributes in and the attributes will render wherever you want them to render in your web component. You can also do a basic slot thing like this, where you just set the slot tag and then whatever text is here will get added to the output. Let's take a look at that. Slots like so. Slots demo. And there's our hello Pete Best and welcome to CFML East. There's your slot tag. So now you can do attributes or slots or both if you want to do both on a fancier web component, if you will. Speaking of, let's look at a real world web component. These hello world demos are nice to give you the basic syntaxes of how to get things in and out of your component, but what would we actually do in a little bit more of a real world setting without getting too fancy and making this demo into a 5-hour thing that no one wants to sit through? Well, one thing we could build is a confirm button demo. Like, you know how when you build an app, you have your rows of data, you have your maybe delete buttons or remove buttons next to each thing. And when you click the delete button, you often want to have a modal pop up that says, hey, are you sure you want to do that before actually deleting whatever the code is, or deleting the item from your screen or whatever is going on? Rather than having to manually add that, are you sure, did you really want to do this thing every time you've got a delete button somewhere in your app, you can actually make a confirm button web component. And that's what I've done here. I've got some plain HTML with a delete file button. And I've got a URL here for confirming, after you click the delete file button, if they in fact clicked, yes, I do want to do that, then go over to this other URL in the site somewhere. In this case, we're going to go to a file called success.cfm. This part doesn't matter. It can be whatever URL you want. Here's my confirm button constructor. Similar to what we had before, I've moved some things around to, just kind of clean up my code a bit. My constructor calls the super constructor. It also does the shadow DOM initialization stuff up here now. I've got a variable called wrapper, or property called wrapper rather, inside my element. And we're just going to make a button.
Hello and welcome.
And sorry, we've got somebody that's got a mic on. Please mute your mic if you can. I'll check for questions in just a second if we want to do that. And then I've got one attribute we're looking for in this case called confirm URL. And in my connected callback method, we're just looking to see if that thing that we made up above here, my button, if it gets clicked, go ahead and run this method, do confirm click, which is down there. Do confirm click says, draws a confirm box on the screen. Are you sure you wanted to do that? And if you are, then go ahead and forward them off to the new URL. If they're not sure, then go ahead and return false and skip that. Let's take a look at the confirm button demo. If I click that delete button, are you sure you want to do this? If I click cancel, nothing happens. Are you sure you want to do this? Yes. And it goes on to whatever the next URL is and says, okay, thanks. We've deleted that file for you. Not a terribly involved demo, but having written, are you sure you want to do that dialog boxes probably thousands of times at this point, something like this is often helpful to sort of cut down on some of that code, make your reusable pile of tricks a little bit better. So there's a confirm button demo. Another one we can look at is slideshow. We've all probably downloaded various slideshow jQuery plugins or apps of different sorts over the years, or followed a pattern somebody had from another code demo and had to build our own slideshow kind of thing into our application. And if you are using a third-party JS library, then you run the risk of compatibility problems because one JS library may not be compatible with another one, or maybe they cause conflicts because one person did not compartmentalize their data in variables as well as the other one did, or vice versa. You can run into different things like that. Or you can build your own simple slideshow by using a web component. Let's take a look at how to do some of that real quick. Slideshow. So here, I've got my plain HTML file with a little bit of styling at the top, nothing crazy. I have a slideshow tag, and I've got a handful of images inside there. And let's take a look at that and see what it does. And we'll take a look at the code afterward. Slideshow. You can see I get previous and next buttons below that. And if I click on them, it'll cycle through the different images we have here in our slideshow. The only JS I included in my slideshow demo is my slideshow.js file. There's no other jQuery plugin, no other third-party anything in here to do that. I wrote that all with less than 100 lines of code in a slideshow that I pretty liberally stole from a modified version of, or built off of a modified version of this demo that Ray Camden put together. If you're not familiar with Ray Camden's blog, this is a fantastic resource for web component stuff, Alpine.js, Vue, all kinds of JavaScript front-end things. Raymond's got a ton of good resources up there. So I grabbed this demo, he had for doing a progressively enhanced form and modified it into the slideshow thing that works like so. My constructor does the same kind of stuff as before, basically. We're building an image tag in this version. I'm sorry, we're getting the list of images in this version, in this line. And then I'm simply making a div with a slot inside it. The slot is going to be the image I'm looking at currently. And I've got a couple of buttons below that with some text. Here's my previous and next buttons, along with the image one of, in this case, 5, stuff that you saw right here. I've got some code in here to control my next and previous buttons or select them rather. When those buttons are clicked, I've got methods next image and previous image down below. And I'm basically just building up a giant array of images. Well, not really giant, there's 5 of them in my example currently, but I have next image and previous image. I simply move to the different position in the array. If I'm looking at image 2 and I click the next button, move to image number 3. If I'm looking at image 5 and I click previous, move to image 4. So just some simple array manipulation here. After the array math is done, both of those call update image, which is down here. And I'm simply deciding if I'm viewing an image in my array of images, or if we're hiding an image in my array of images, and then just updating the array math. And after that, figure out where we're at in the slideshow, if we're on image 1 or 3 or 7 or whatever. Name my component just like before, and that's it. And now I have this real quick and easy slideshow. No third-party JavaScript required. No compatibility issues worried about either. Just drops in and works pretty well. So backend stuff. If you have a backend server language, PHP or CFML, ASP.NET, any of those that you want to combine these with, you can, of course, mix and match web components. They're not like React or Vue, where you kind of have to build all of your front end in that thing and then have a separate backend be pure APIs. It's closer to something like jQuery, if you've ever dealt with jQuery before, where you can have some pages in your site use jQuery when they need to, and other pages in your site don't have jQuery on them because they just don't have that kind of functionality requirement. You can do the same thing here with web components. Use them when you need to. They're self-contained modules. Don't use them when you don't need to use them on something. So let me open up this demo here, and we'll take a look at how this part works. Number 8. So here I have a CFM file, but this would work the exact same way if it were PHP, .NET. Any server-side tool would work the exact same thing. Instead of having CF set up here, if it were PHP, it'd be the PHP tag. So I have a server-side array of stuff, and I've got my HTML down here below. Again, where it says CF output, just replace that with like a PHP loop or whatever the ASP repeater control is called. I think it's just repeater. It's been a while since I've used that. Any of those tools where you can mix and match client and server side together. Here I have a web component called guitar player instead of our hello world example. And guitar player looks like this. Set some defaults. Here's the attributes that we care about. Here's my connected callback method. We're doing the shadow DOM thing again. Here's my style info to make everything inside my guitar player component look pretty. And I've got some HTML down below there to lay things out how I want them laid out. My web component looks like this. It takes 3 attributes in, name, band, and photo. Those are being provided server-side by this server-side array up here of stuff called rockstars. I'm simply looping over that with my loop and then drawing each of those individual items on the screen. And I can do that and get my info on the screen there. And notice how when I hover over the images, they get a dashed red border around them. Just have a little bit fancier CSS happening in this one than we had previously. Right there, I've got the name, hover, and image hover thing showing that you can change the text screen if you hover over the name, or give us a nice dash border if I hover over the image. There's the green text, there's the red dash border image. You can get as fancy as you want with the CSS stuff. But the main takeaway here is I can call these server side and they'll still render out to the screen the exact same way as they did in the previous demos. When I render it and look at the screen here in the browser, these are guitar player tags as far as the browser is concerned. Inside the shadow DOM for that, you can see the style block and the div with the spans inside it and so on. but the guitar player web component is treated as a first-class citizen in how things are laid out. You can talk to APIs with them too. This is just like any other chunk of JavaScript. It doesn't care what server backend you have. It can be PHP, it can be COBOL, it can be CFML, it can be .NET, it can be a Java servlet page, whatever you got, as long as that thing can send out valid JSON to the browser, cool. That's all you need to do is have a URL that can kick JSON back to the front end, and that's what you get. There are a bunch of different ways to get JSON back. It just varies from server-side language to language. They all have varieties of frameworks and add-on packs and things like that to deal with. I gave this talk last week at a conference in Washington, D.C. that was based on the CFML Cold Fusion space. So these are a list of different tools that Cold Fusion folks can use to get that stuff to happen. But it doesn't have to be done this way. Of course, if you're on PHP, if you're on Go or Ruby or whatever else, use whatever methods there are to kick JSON back to the client, and you're good to go. And with that, let's look at another demo of how to get stuff back from your server. Number 9. Here's the text on the screen. Let's take a look at what the code looks like to get that demo to actually function. Number 9 looks like this. Here I have my index file again. In this one, we have a tag guitar players, plural. And in my guitar players, plural JS file, I've got the default stuff at the top, just like before. Here's a new method we have, though, called find Rockstar's API. This one's actually it's using fetch to go hit an API URL. And that URL kicks back some JSON for us. I deserialize the JSON, save it to a variable called Rockstars, and return that back to whoever it is that called this chunk of code. Down here in my connected callback, that's where we called that method. Save our array of Rockstars back in here. This is JSON. And then we're going to loop over that array of Rockstars and just build up individual divs for each of the things that came back from that API call. Combine them together into the inner HTML in our shadow DOM, and that's what gets rendered on the screen. Let's go ahead and take a look at that URL real quick just to see what happens when I go there, /API/legacy CFM. And I'll load this in a new window. API legacy CFM. You can see it is in fact getting us back JSON with some stuff in it. And that stuff looks like so. There's our things. And again, I'll right click on that and inspect. And here's my guitar players tag. And inside there is a shadow DOM with all the different individual divs and style blocks for things inside my guitar players component. All right. Some server-side languages will let you not only embed the web component in the page itself, but you can also make the HTTP request out to the server, not in the web component itself, but sort of ahead of time in a different line of code. Like in PHP, you can do this, and in .NET and CFML and all kinds of other places. It's really just a variation of the demo we just saw, but I'll put it in here for the sake of completion. Here's my guitar player singular web component. Nothing really different in here from what we've seen in the previous ones. And here I've got line 2 is doing a CF HTTP call. Turn that one off. That's a fancier demo that I want to deal with today. This one on the same legacy CFM file that we saw just a moment ago right here, exact same URL. Saving the results to a variable called Rockstars. We're deserializing that JSON, turning it into a valid array, and then I'm simply looping over that array and making one instance of my guitar player component for each thing that came back from our API call. When we get back, we got 4 or 5 things back from that API call earlier. It's the same call. I'm not going to refresh the page. And now in demo 10, we get all these guys back in the stuff that we wanted to see. There's our results back being rendered as guitar players. I'll right click and inspect. So you can see that I'm not lying to you. And there's our guitar player web component tags. One of the neat things about Cold Fusion, I will show you this part now, is I can actually go straight to not just a URL for like a .cfm or .php file. I can point a URL straight to a CFC, which is just a class with methods in it, component, component and class mean the same thing in Cold Fusion land. I have a method here called get guitarists. Here's my array of stuff. I'm returning that back to the outside chunk of code that's getting called, and I'm going to go to that URL now. I can just run that method directly in the browser, and it will hit back all the stuff. That doesn't look like JSON, though. That looks like just plain text being drawn on the screen. One of the things I can do in Cold Fusion is simply add and return format equals JSON to the URL, and look, it will automatically format my return data as JSON, which is kind of cool. So then I can take that URL with the return format JSON thing on the end of it and stick that in my code. So this line automatically returns JSON, line 2. Line 4 automatically deserializes the JSON, saves it here, and then I can get the data back that I want. And here in my method, I have this little filter that I've written. See if I pass a genre in as an argument. See, we have genres for each of our rock stars. If I go here to the URL, I can also add on n genre equals, in this case, let's say punk. And now it will return me just the people in my array that have punk defined as their genre. And I can take that URL, and instead of getting back all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, I can go here, paste that in. Now I've got the n genre equals punk thing on the end there. And now when I reload this page, it'll filter down to just the people that have punk data on them. I didn't have to change my web component at all. I simply changed the data coming back from the API, using that fun trick that I like to do with Cold Fusion language. And it works. So there's a couple of different ways we can get data back from our server and suck them into our web component and draw them on the screen. If you have kind of a legacy app that's more of a traditional request response, maybe a PHP or .NET app or something, and you want to start migrating it to a modern front end like Vue or React, things like that, web components are a great migration tool to go from one to the other, because you can leave all of your old legacy code in place and find the little self-contained spots of functionality and just one by one start turning them into web components. You don't have to rewrite your entire rest of your app. You don't have to build a whole API suite from scratch to start. Just like find a div that maybe it used to be a sortable div using some jQuery plugin. Well, just turn that one div into a sortable thing using a web component, or get rid of all of the, are you sure you meant to do that, chunks of hard-coded JavaScript, and make a confirm button, put them in different places in your app, and just like make a little checklist of stuff you can turn into web components easily. And then as you get further and further into that path, your app is that much further along to becoming a single page application on the front end, just by organically, moving your code that direction. You do not have to rebuild your web components as a JavaScript framework. Just drop the web components into your JavaScript framework, Vue, React, whatever, and they'll all work exactly the same way. So to sum up, very little syntax to deal with on components. You got to know what a class is and a constructor. You've got a couple of lifecycle methods to use. At most, you'll have, I think it's about 6 lifecycle methods, depending on how fancy your component gets. For the most part, you'll have 2, constructor and connected callback. I guess the ones for the attributes as well, so maybe 4. So yeah, there's a little bit of machinery boilerplate stuff, but they're not terribly large. You don't have to go, get a really involved dev environment or whatever to start using them. Everything else just depends on how involved your web component is. And you can integrate other JavaScript libraries in with them too. If you wanted to write a web component that used jQuery or some JavaScript slideshow out there, or whatever else you have that you might find value out of, they're technically compatible, but your mileage may vary, because that of course depends on how well your web component is written and how well the other JavaScript is written, depending on whoever wrote that. So the better quality of the code on both sides, the better compatibility experience you'll have across the board with that stuff. You'll notice that my attributes, first name, last name, things like that, those were all in lowercase. That is a requirement of the web component syntax. You cannot have camel case on your attribute names. That is currently, basically it's a bug in the spec. They'll maybe fix it later. Corbin can probably correct me on that when we get to the Q&A part, I'm sure, if I'm wrong on that. But yeah, just keep them all lowercase. Otherwise you'll run into bugs, and it's annoying to try to track that down. Use the attributes like I did, first name and last name, to pass input stuff into your component, and use things like custom events to broadcast output out of your component to other chunks of JavaScript if you need to do that sort of thing. Just like you have events like on click and on mouse over, just make a custom event for whatever it is your web component does that you want other chunks of JavaScript to know about and do something with. Like I mentioned before, the hyphen is required, hello dash world instead of hello world. So use the hyphen part of the naming convention to your advantage to organize your stuff a little bit better. Since you have to use it, you might as well get some self-documentation into your code base as a result. You'll notice that we did not touch on elements like form elements, sorry, input boxes and checkboxes and that sort of thing. Those are a little bit more tricky to do. I really should do a demo as its own thing about how to do that. The short answer is there's a thing called form data interface. If you want to write your own custom input and checkboxes and radio buttons, look at how to use the form data interface to build them, and that'll get you pretty far down that path. It's not terribly difficult, but if you've never done a web component before, it's just a little bit more involved than I wanted to get into in this presentation. And don't use web components for search engine sensitive things like the confirmation button thing and the slideshow itself. Probably fine, because the slideshow, next image, and previous image buttons are not going to be indexed by the search engine. The images themselves will, so use real image tags for that stuff. Anything you have on your website that's currently in p tags and section and header tags and aside tags, that's actual content that you want Google to pick up and index, leave that alone. Use the web components for the fancier application type stuff, but leave your content the way Google likes your content to be, so your SEO stuff doesn't get dinged as a result. So obviously, the more web components you have, the more JavaScript files you might have as well. You can have one JS file with X number of web components in it. Generally, I don't do that. Generally, if I have one JS file, it's got one web component in it. If I have 3 JS files, I have 3 web components, one in each of the files. Or if I have maybe 2 or 3 small-ish related web components, I might put them in one file just to keep the related stuff all in one spot. The downside, though, is, as you get more web components, you have more JS files to deal with. The more JS files there are, the more things have to be pumped out to the browser every time someone goes to your website. So to minimize bandwidth issues and things like that, make sure your site is still snappy and responsive. You can always use a bundler like Webpack or something like that to squish all the web component stuff into one JS file instead of 100 of them. And of course, always load your JS files at the end of your HTML page for best performance on everything. That's not specific to web components. That's just generally a good idea. Some other places to check out stuff about web components. Like I mentioned, Ray Camden's blog is great. Raymond is I'll probably get his title wrong. He works at Adobe and he is some sort of developer relations, developer advocate kind of person. So he writes tons of really easy to follow code examples. Raymond is a buddy of mine. We speak at the same conferences. So I'll vouch for his blog being great. Web Components in Space is a good YouTube video series written by Ben Farrell. Ben's another great Adobe person. And instead of blogging, Ben does YouTube videos about web components. Ben's also written a really good book on how to get started with them. So if you are a physical book kind of person, look on Amazon for Ben Farrell's book about web components. Some dude named Unicorn Utterances, some blog named Unicorn Utterances, rather, is written by our own Corbin, another great resource for web components and all kinds of fun JavaScript stuff. So check out the blog when you have a bunch of time to go down a very big rabbit hole and learn all kinds of great stuff about JavaScript and the browsers. And then these guys are two other good websites about basically making sure web components work the way they're supposed to. And every time a new web component thing comes out or a new JavaScript library like Vue or React comes out, these guys make sure that they stay compatible and they run unit tests on as much of that stuff as possible to make sure that it all works the way you expect it to. If you like web components and you want to learn more about these rather than just the vanilla stuff that we learned about here, Lit and Stencil are 2 web component frameworks that a lot of people like. They've done lots of the fancy legwork for you to build other more interesting web components than just the vanilla ones we saw today. Full disclosure, the ones we looked at were vanilla JavaScript, required nothing to be installed on your laptop. Lit and Stencil break that rule. So these are things that you would install like through Node. You have to have some command line stuff going on to get them to work. So they're a little bit more involved than the stuff we saw today, but maybe the extra work will be worth the trade-off because of something else that they do for you that maybe, helps your project out quite a bit. And of course, there's also a ton of stuff on GitHub. Just go search for web components on there and you'll find 50 bazillion repos from different people that have done web component things you might want to check out as well. If this seemed like a lot of stuff to go over, or if you feel overwhelmed with just the web in general, because there's always something new coming out every week, one of my favorite tips is learning something in 30 minutes a day. I learned this a while ago. I read an article about a guy who had an open source app he was building on the side of his regular day job. And he'd come home from work and he'd go, okay, tonight I'm going to work on my open source app. And he'd be tired and wouldn't do it. He'd say, okay, tomorrow I'm going to work on my open source app. And he'd be tired and wouldn't do it. He'd go, okay, this weekend, I'm going to sit down at the desktop and crank away on my app all weekend long. And he'd get to Saturday and his wife would have stuff for him to do and his kid would have a soccer game and he'd never get anything done. So what he decided was, I'm going to work on my app every single day. Even if it's only 30 minutes a day, I'm going to work on my app. And what he found was, even in just 30-minute increments every day in a row, the 30-minute chunks added up really, really quickly. And he got a ton of progress done on his application in no time flat, because every time he sat down to work on it, he only had to remember what he'd done yesterday. He didn't have to think about, what did I do 6 weeks ago, the last time I sat down to work on my app? It was always just the day before. And everybody can find 30 minutes to work on their app. You can turn the basketball game on mute and crank away for half an hour. You can turn off the Seinfeld rerun. You can do whatever the thing is you can do. Split your lunch hour in half, eat your food, and then work for 30 minutes a day on a project. Do whatever you need to do. But I promise you can learn web components this way. You can learn Angular this way. You can learn whatever the thing is you want to learn. Come up with a project, a concise thing a goal you want to have. You can do it in half-hour chunks every day, whether it's web components or something else. I find this a fantastic learning tool for learning new things and for just completing projects that I've had laying around for a long time. I've written songs for my band this way. A friend of mine wrote and published her first book this way. Really, really easy way to learn, not just web components, but anything else you might have going on in life that you want to tackle. And with that, that's ways to get a hold of me. I'm on the Twitter and the webs and the GitHubs and all of the stuff. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and get to any questions people have. Looks like there's a lot of chat messages over here. Let me read these real quick to see if there's anything I need to address.
It's mostly memeing on me, I think.
Mostly Corbin memeing. All right. React has some challenges to web component interrupt. I'm new here, but multi-window functionality is of interest to me, so maybe adaptive callback is useful. It's useful here. We never ended up using multi-window functionality with our Vue app. It seemed non-trivial. Yeah, I don't know. I have not used adaptive callback for multi-window stuff or for anything else. That sounds like it would probably be useful for it sounds like adaptive callback would be useful in a multi-window situation. Corbin, have you done that sort of thing?
I've done something different than adopted callback, but I have done multi-window support in an application.
You did something different than adaptive callback within the construct of a web component?
We didn't really use web components, but we didn't use any components. We just supported HTML. Like we allowed, basically what I did is I built a web application that allowed you to inject your own HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to create widgets that you could put in OBS. And then in OBS, we'd like pass you messages to your custom JavaScript, HTML, and whatever, and allowed you to be able to create widgets that would like interact with Twitch or YouTube or whatever. And the way that we did that was something called shared workers, which are like web workers, but they work within the confines. Like say you have 5 tabs open, the broadcast channel that emits the message will come from one singleton. And as soon as you close all 5 windows, they all go away. You can also combine, super quick aside, you can also combine shared workers with like a Redux middleware. So what you can do is you can create the ability to have, like, this is a kind of old example, but it's the only one that I could find online. What you can do is you can have like one state in your shared worker that acts like Redux and then broadcasts synchronous updates to all of your windows. So
okay, so a few different options to check out there depending on how crazy you want to go with them. Thank you, Corbin. Let's see here, what else is that? Certainly trio, that's Corbin. That's more. I'm thinking pass a whole send item, no window, activated. Sorry, there's a whole bunch of chat going on while I was talking here. I'm looking for questions real quick, and there's a bunch of messages. Talk to me later. Spit Nolan, talk to me later so I can help you fix those images using CSS. Oh, my Rockstar images that are all distorted and
Yeah,
everything?
they're a little stretched. So you can use object fit cover to fix that.
Okay.
Line of CSS.
All right, send me the line. That was a quick demo I put together a couple weeks ago, and I haven't really bothered with making it look pretty. The main takeaway was the web component stuff, and I didn't bother looking at the CSS, but yeah, I wouldn't mind cleaning that up. Sure, send me what you got. I'll take a look. See here if there's any other questions in here. Took a screenshot.
There's one question right at the end here.
Okay. Sorry, there's a whole bunch of stuff in here. The Pomodoro method. Yes, Pomodoro method works really well for blocking off 30 minutes a day to do things. Pomodoro is good stuff. Still don't completely understand the use case for web components when there are things like React, Angular, besides being able to use vanilla JavaScript. The use case for web components instead of React is if I have a use case for it, among others, is if I have a traditional web request response website. So like an older PHP site, for example, there is no React front end. It's all just .php files that are individual things. I want to have a chunk of reusable functionality that I drop into, let's say 10 of those different PHP files. I'm not going to rewrite my entire PHP application in Vue just to make a little thing reusable across 10% of my site. I can make a web component and drop that web component into the 10 PHP files. And now that is a reusable chunk of JavaScript that works the way I want it to work without having to rewrite my entire application to do so. Second benefit to it, if I have some sort of fancy, maybe proprietary UI thing or business logic that I want somebody to write, and we're not going to use it just in our Vue app, we're going to use it in Vue and then somebody else's React app and then maybe an Angular app somewhere else too. Rather than writing that 3 times, the Vue way, the Angular way, the React way, write it once as a web component and drop that web component into the Vue app, the React app, the vanilla JavaScript app, the PHP legacy app. That it's a self-contained thing that will work in all of those different constructs without any changes needed, basically. So there's a couple different ways to take advantage of web components. What else do we have in here? How do you keep...
And that's a lot more common than you might think. In large enterprises, it's very, very common to have an application that uses React or have an application that uses like one framework or another framework and like kind of mix and match frameworks as there's like multiple different teams and things grow and scale.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That's the bigger the company, the more likely that is to happen. Like even at Adobe doesn't always use Adobe products to build Adobe stuff. They sometimes use Adobe products and sometimes they use other things. And so having a mechanism where you can write code once and share it among different teams just gets everybody that much closer to the finish line that much more quickly. Then you have one spot to fix your bugs and everyone benefits, all the other usual code reusability benefits. Let's see, there's another question from Sean. How do you keep query select all image from selecting image tags outside the component? Oh, Corbin got that one for me. The set query selector. Thank you, Corbin. Because web component extends HTML element, it supports all of these. Corbin on top of the Q&A for me in the chat while I'm working away on the presentation. Thank you very much. Can you link us to the YouTube channel this would post on? Yes. So I run South of Shasta. That's my consulting business. And if you search on YouTube for South of Shasta, we have our YouTube channel there. There's a playlist in our channel with all of the Stack Interactive videos up through whatever the last one was that we posted is up there. And this one will be up there in the next couple of weeks. And there's a couple more that have not been edited just yet that are going to be up on the website or on the YouTube channel shortly as well. So yeah, check for South of Shasta and then just look for the playlist for Stack Interactive. And I'll get that up there for you. How often do you use web components? I am using some combination of web components and vanilla JavaScript way more, let's say this last 2 years than previously. I was on a variety of projects before that were some combination of either vanilla code or maybe jQuery or Vue or Angular or something else. And let's see, about a year ago, my team and I basically got 2 new projects we've been working on pretty regularly. And I just made the decision at the beginning of that project that there's no reason to go by default with jQuery or older stuff that's been around for a long time. We're not doing anything, that needs to have legacy stuff in it like jQuery. Browsers support all kinds of things now. We can get everything we need to get done with either vanilla JavaScript or some web components. And so I'd say it is currently a small but growing regularly percentage of stuff that we're doing in our day-to-day work. I'll just got here. AJ, this is incredibly fantastic. Thank you. I'm new to development. While some new concepts were a bit above my current level, overall I was able to grasp the concepts and look forward to playing with them. Excellent. I'm glad you got value out of the presentation. Are there any other questions from anybody while we're hanging out here? Now that we're done doing the presentation too, feel free to unmute your microphone and ask away if you want to do something like that. It was really hard to focus on going through the slides and giving the demos when there were like kids talking in the background and cars honking and stuff. So, but go ahead and unmute and chat away if you need to ask a question.
I also wrote I remembered that talking about like comparing and contrasting React to other frameworks. I wrote an article specifically about that topic. So yeah.
There it is in the chat. Yeah. Check out Corbin's blog, Unicorn Utterances. There are tons of really good posts up there about basically all things modern JavaScript related, not just web components, but React stuff and, how the web is doing this, that, and the other. It's a really, really useful website to check out. So typically, one more question. Yeah. So typical use case is web components equal to JavaScript duct tape. Sure. You can look at it that way.
It's one use case.
Yeah.
I mean, like frameworks like Lit build on top of web components, right? So like you can totally build a large scale application using Lit. I know that Google's built a bunch of them, which Google built Lit, so it only makes sense. But I mean, even like the biggest challenges with web components are typically server-side rendering. And even we're starting to see solutions like that with Lit and Astro and a few others. We're starting to solve the problem of server-side rendering with web components. So, you can build a full-scale application with web components. And I think Nolan pointed out earlier that you can build parts of your application that are interactive. So for example, if you do use, and like, here's an example. The most complex website I've ever built is Framework, the website for my book. But I used components to build out this website. And then when you render it, you can render it without JavaScript and it'll still display all the functionality of the website, just like without some animations and stuff. So you can build out a website like this, sprinkle in, my interactivity needs were really weird for this website. So I actually went with Preact when you have JavaScript enabled. But let's say that this website was an application as opposed to a marketing website. And you want to be able to have fast loading, multi-page applications, and maybe you're building with a framework like CMFL or something like that. You can have that sprinkle of interactivity without losing that really small and slim bundle size, because you're only adding interactivity to this button and to this, and you're sharing a singleton of the same framework without having to build out scaffolding for the whole application and a router and all this other stuff, like reinventing the web tools.
Right. And when you start doing things the web component way too, it makes it really easy to switch from React to Vue to Angular to whatever. Because you have to rebuild much less of your actual application logic. That's all done in web components that just drag and drop from one framework to the next. It makes it really easy to try out different frameworks. If you like the syntax style from one versus the other, if you like the build process from one versus the other, you don't have to reinvent your entire app. Like Corbin said, you can just take advantage of the parts you need to take advantage of. You can do so. Same thing with Preact or Astro or any of the other tools you mentioned, and go down one of those routes. Good. Well, then thank you very much for joining me tonight. Please check us out on sackinteractive.com or we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. You can contact me at any of the contact info I had up on the screen earlier, and I'll happily add you to the email list if you want to learn more about our next SAC Interactive meeting. I don't know what the topic is going to be in May. I actually have a conflict. I'll be speaking at a conference that week, so I'm trying to get that sorted out right now, but we'll get info up on social media as soon as we have that dialed in. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a good night. Appreciate you being here.